It would be nice to only watch great television, but let's be honest, television that's truly great isn't always easy to find or pay for, and just what makes something great is subjective. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's nice to pass a little free time with some entertainment that may not be fine art, but can at least hold your attention for a little while. Well, the opportunity for consuming substellar TV has increased over the last couple of years, with quarantine and social distancing, as well as working a job where it's especially important to avoid COVID. My social life is not very active at the time, and the number of movies I've seen in theaters since COVID reached the States has not gone past zero. So I have instead seen a number of TV shows that may not be good, or may actually be okay, but at least have elements that really make me shake my head. This is Cringe-Watching, a new series looking at some truly questionable pieces of television I happened to watch over the course of the pandemic. One of my local channels, obviously wanting for new content at a time where none was being filmed, pretty early in the pandemic picked up some cheap shows formerly exclusive to streaming networks. The one I caught was Tell Me a Story, originally released on CBS All Access, now known as Paramount Plus. Tell Me a Story was 2 seasons, 20 episodes, and an anthology created by Kevin Williamson, whom you might know for Scream. The idea of the show is that each season, 3 stories within the same metropolitan area interweave, making one full arc for the community. At least that's the conceit. The other major concept is that the show tells a modern, real world adaptation of traditional European fairy tales. If that sounds familiar, it may be because the show is the US American version of the Spanish television program Cuéntame un Cuento. Probably mispronounced that, so I'm sorry. You may also recognize it as pretty much the exact same premise of both Once Upon a Time and Grimm, both of which came out only a handful of years earlier. However, unlike both of those shows, this is actually set in a mostly believable world. Sure, there's a heightened sense of reality with coincidences and improbabilities, but nothing happens that makes you say, oh, that's impossible. There's no magic, no fantastic creatures, and the characters have to deal with real world problems, for the most part. To me, I found this much more interesting of an idea. Throwing sapient wolves into modern times may be fun, but the original point of these stories was largely meant to teach lessons applicable for the time, so knowing this was more of a straightforward retooling piqued my interest. Also catching my interest was a number of the cast members. The 3 leads, kind of, are James Wolk, Danya Ramirez, and Danielle Campbell. While I didn't really know Campbell from anything save a super small child performance in Prison Break, I was familiar with both Wolk and Ramirez, and liked both of their performances that I had seen. Throw in Kim Cattrall, Sabrina Guevara, and Michael Raymond James, the cast alone had my attention. Unfortunately, things fell apart when it came to most of the stories. Wolk plays Jordan Evans, a wealthy young restaurateur whose fiancée is murdered by 3 jewelry store robbers. He seeks them out with the intention of exacting his revenge. This is modeled off of The 3 Little Pigs. Danya Ramirez plays Hannah Perez, an army vet who needs to help out her brother Gabe, played by Davi Santos, after he accidentally kills a man that tried to assault his boyfriend and steals a big bag of cash, bringing unwanted criminal attention as they try to find a place to hide. This is modeled off of Hansel and Gretel. Danielle Campbell plays Kayla Powell, a high school student that does not listen to her dad or grandma, and ends up sleeping with a man at a club whom she meets the next day as her substitute teacher. Suddenly, spates of disappearances occur at her high school. This is modeled off of Little Red Riding Hood. I'll try to stay away from spoilers for a bit in case you are interested in watching this for yourself. The Perez siblings have the most compelling story. Ramirez gives a great, very subtle performance as Hannah, and as a Purple Heart vet, there's a level of pain and responsibility that undercuts the lack of control she and her brother have in their whole situation. I also appreciate that she and her fellow veteran are far more capable than all of the part-time criminals. Santos also gives a solid performance, which took me a second to appreciate. He starts out seemingly a little too incompetent to be likable, but it becomes clear that Gabe is not just a fool, but somebody traumatized trying his best to deal with circumstances well beyond his control, sometimes dealing with things like drugs and meaningless sex, but also just trying to do his best in a world that's not easy for him. The two of them have great on-screen chemistry together, and while the two don't have much of a resemblance, the way they interact is really believable for a brother and a sister. The villains of this story may as well be non-existent, honestly, which is a shame. Some of the most interesting parts of Hansel and Gretel stories are the witches. However, since they aren't the focus here, the majority of this story works. Even if it sometimes feels like the bad guys are way too smart in the middle and then way too incompetent by the end, I would have really liked if this was just its own show by itself. The Three Little Pigs story sadly falls a little flat, which is a shame given Wolk's performance is actually quite chilling. While the dead woman motivation is problematic to say the least and far from new, this isn't the typical revenge fantasy fashion. There is nothing gratuitous about this. Evans is being torn apart by his grief, and while he gets to be menacing sometimes, he never gets to be cool. His situation is not one you're supposed to see as something you want, but miserable, and he truly does not come across as anything but tortured. Where it falls apart is in the predictability of the story. Straight from the beginning, we see how it's going to go, as unlike the others, there's no real change up of the steps of the story. From the beginning, you know who is the wolf and who are the three pigs. There's obviously different characterization, but since everything is telegraphed to the point where they even lampshade it heavily, there's no surprise. That's fine, but for a story to be exactly what you think it will be can detract from the experience. At least the writing doesn't make the main character of this story unbearable to watch. The Little Red Riding Hood story is by far the worst, largely due to its characters. With the exception of Kim Cattrall's grandmother character, everybody is either miserably horrible or numbingly dull. The kids are so irresponsible it's hard to believe that they've lived long enough to be near adulthood instead of jumping into the nearest van of poisoned candy, and the adults treat dangerous situations like nothing serious. This story is more of a traditional horror show, and like most bad traditional horror, they rely on tropes like reckless party obsession and endlessly belligerent children to get the characters in dangerous circumstances. This isn't even getting into how incredibly uncomfortable it is watching characters that are supposedly minors engaging in activities like intercourse and substance abuse. I know the actors are of age, thankfully, but it still grosses me out. This was also, again, on a local network, not on the original online streaming service, so I can't say how much worse it was on that. What I can give the Riding Hood story is that, at the least, this one feels the most like an adaptation of the original story. It's still about a child predator who pretends to be somebody they aren't, and the child should be wary. Meanwhile, the original Three Little Pigs was about not taking the cheap and easy route when it comes to building your future. This story is about how you shouldn't kill people, shouldn't go to a jewelry store that's about to be robbed. There's not really much of a lesson there at all, which, if you recall, is what I said really intrigued me about the show. Hansel and Gretel had a message of familial love and distrusting strangers, which is at least carried over here, but the story doesn't really follow in the original terms of plot, like even a little bit. In fact, the channel on which I watched this show originally cut out the opening animation for almost all of the episodes except for the final one, which meant that I didn't see all of the cartoons that let you know what three stories were being adapted. And so for about half of the show, I had no idea that Hannah and Gabe were supposed to be Hansel and Gretel. Alright, here I'll get more into spoilers. Some things I quite liked included making the three pigs come from three different classes. That's an interesting way to convey the different building materials. Rather than straw, sticks, and bricks, we have lower class, middle class, and upper class. Also, initially I found the circle of friends Evans had to be vapid and irritating, but they actually did something clever with that as well. The performative conversations they have where they all try to out-liberal each other is annoyingly shallow, but it is actually juxtaposed with their inability to be supportive friends when he loses his fiancée, further driving Evans towards the condition where he becomes focused solely on exacting his revenge, even though it consumes him. I'll also give credit to the one place where the show intersects the storylines in a somewhat interesting manner. It's revealed that the crime boss behind the mobsters chasing Hannah and Gabe is the same woman whom we have slowly seen starting a relationship with Kayla's father. It manages to be surprising without being out of nowhere. But now some criticism to go with the spoilers. There is a complete cloud hanging over the show that they both want to showcase and avoid. The season was made in mid-2018 and uses, as a backdrop, a police protest. The first episode has Jordan and his fiancée attending this protest, only they just make an appearance before going to the jewelry store to pick out a ring when it is robbed by three masked protesters. Yeah. Later on, it is shown that not only were these three just using the protest as an excuse to wear masks and help shift the blame away from themselves, their leader is in fact a cop himself. And is this cause for a meaningful talk about police corruption? Not really, at least according to the show. The good cop has to find out the other cops are crooked, just so she can be murdered by them. But not only is there no justice for her, there's not even serious evaluation of the problem. The bad cops aren't bad because of their power or how power corrupts them, but just because they're bad people. Yet we never get an examination of how the power structures keep them safe from consequences. It's also worth mentioning that while police brutality can and does happen to anybody in the US and indeed many other nations where the show is not set, it of course disproportionately affects black people. But the focus here rests on the white victims of the black corrupt cop's violence, while the black cop murdered by the white corrupt cop's death is given very little focus. I get it. This third of the show focuses on Jordan. But if the show is uninterested in actually exploring with any sincerity the prevalence of abuse intersecting with power, and would rather just have it be good cop versus bad cops, maybe they shouldn't use a police brutality protest as a set piece at the beginning of the story, and not actually portray corruption as anything different than comic crime. I also need to address the very heavy spoiler of Nick, the substitute teacher who ends up being a stalker and murderer. So once again, it is incredibly, incredibly horrible that the show sexualizes minors. Let me be clear, acknowledging minors sometimes have sex with each other is not sexualizing them, but the camera and the writing is not simply meant to show that it is happening, but how it is happening. It would be gross no matter what. But then it also has a minor having sex with an adult, while the show happily parades the fact that it is not statutory rape in the state of New York for an adult to sleep with a 17-year-old. That doesn't make it something I want to see or contemplate. And when it is revealed that not only did Nick know he was sleeping with a child, he specifically sought her out because he was obsessed with her mom, it is incredibly disturbing, which to the show's credit, it is portrayed as such. But when it plays the beginning of the relationship, and in fact anything to do with these teenagers and their sex lives, as titillation, it trying to then bait and switch by making the child predator I already heavily disliked both falls flat and feels regressive. And because of these two main problems, I myself cannot recommend the show. While I do think there are some interesting things in the Three Little Pigs story and find the Hansel and Gretel story to be quite entertaining on its own, I wouldn't say anybody should watch it. Now this doesn't mean watching it was unbearable, on the contrary, but what was lackluster made enough of the show uncomfortable enough for me that I would not tell someone else to watch it, even if the premise intrigued them. If you do, though, I recommend you at least go in prepared for some gross content. Have any of you watched this show? What did you think about it? Let me know in the comments below, please, and have a great rest of the day.